breaking news!
Okay, we'll start with this. A continuation to a story we talked about in my previous upload, that WBO has formally reordered 30-day negotiation period for Demetrius Andrade versus Janibek Alimkhanuly. WBO middleweight title consolidation clash. Andrade represented by Dimitri Salita Promotions in talks. And because they're in talks, and because Demetrius Andrade has a scarcity of options at this point, there's a distinct possibility that the fight happens because, well, the offers aren't pouring in from Matchroom to bring him back over to their side of things. They don't have very many options for Demetrius.
I don't know, maybe a Saunders fight at super middleweight or a John Ryder fight?
None of those fights are big fights. None of those fights really move the needle. They don't move it any more over there on that side of the Atlantic Ocean than a Janibek does here on this side. The difference being that this fight is a title fight. This would be Demetrius Andrade attempting to hang on to his WBO title. I know of no offers pouring in from Matchroom, certainly no offers pouring in by way of the PBC.
There's a distinct possibility that this fight happens.
The saving grace, the silver lining for unbeaten southpaw from Kazakhstan, Janibek Alimkhanuly, who needs a big name, a high-profile opponent. And while Demetrius Andrade overall doesn't have much of a profile, he still has a better profile than many of the fighters that Janibek Alimkhanuly has fought so far. Hassan Endam, Rob Brandt, Danny Dignam.
This would be a battle of the unbeaten southpaws.
Unbeaten two-division champion of Rhode Island, Demetrius Andrade, and Janibek Alimkhanuly, though they do have their differences. Aside from which hand they lead with, which hand is their jab hand, there are subtle differences to these fighters. Janibek Alimkhanuly is a more aggressive customer than Demetrius Andrade is. Demetrius, his base style lives somewhere between the pure boxer and the boxer puncher, though he really is more pure boxer than boxer puncher.
A veteran of 31 professional contests, 31 professional bouts.
Certainly the far more experienced fighter in the fight, 34 years old, to Janibek Alimkhanuly, who's a very spry
29 years old, not the youngest unbeaten up-and-comer, but certainly not the oldest. He still has time to make a splash. He could make one battering Demetrius Andrade.
Even with this fight, there are a scarcity of options for Janibek Alimkhanuly, and that's why it's important that Top Rank deliver him the scalp of Demetrius Andrade. That's why I think there's a genuine possibility that the people at Top Rank make this fight worth Demetrius's while, because their guy Janibek, he needs a fight, he needs a belt, he needs a signature performance.
It would actually be better for Janibek if he gets to share the ring with Demetrius than forcing Demetrius to vacate his title.
Beat the man to be the man, as they say, the man at least with the WBO. If he were to force Demetrius to vacate the title and become the champion by default, that really wouldn't do much for Janibek's profile. He needs to make a splash, a big one. He needs a signature fight.
It's not as simple as getting a belt and becoming the next big thing at middleweight. He needs to get people's attention, and what better way to do that than to dish out Demetrius Andrade his first professional loss?
You have to remember what the state of the middleweight division is and what it's going to be. The biggest name at this weight really is Gennady Golovkin, but Gennady's set to go up there to super middleweight, take on Canelo Alvarez. And if he gets beat, doesn't retire, decides to go back down, Janibek has already stated that he has no intention of taking on his countryman, his elder. He respects him too much.
So even if Gennady doesn't retire and he returns to middleweight, there ain't going to be no passing of the torch fight, not based on that.
If he does retire and those two alphabet titles he holds at middleweight go vacant, Erislandy Lara is already in line by way of the WBA to pick up that title if Gennady relinquishes it.
Imagine a scenario where Gennady vacates a WBA title, Erislandy Lara becomes full champion, he's a PBC fighter.
How much more difficult would that make the situation for Janibek Alimkhanuly at middleweight if more of those alphabet titles end up on the PBC side of things? There's already one over there, the green belt, which is held by Jermel Charlo, who had no interest in unifying with Demetrius. You think he'd be interested in unifying with Janibek?
That fucking chance.
At that point, Janibek's best bet at procuring a second alphabet title would be if Gennady also vacates the IBF, and he could perhaps face his top-ranked stablemate, Esquiva Falcao, Brazilian Olympian Esquiva Falcao, unbeaten guy. That would be his best chance, his best bet at procuring a second alphabet title. What they need to do for Janibek in the absence of a signature fight is keep him busy, keep him active, and keep him racking up those highlight reel knockouts to where he can build a buzz organically, as opposed to gaining a buzz from a signature fight that he can't have if Demetrius makes the decision to vacate the WBO. It's not as simple as just procuring a belt and being launched into stardom in the sport of boxing. Janibek needs a signature fight just as much as he needs an alphabet title.
Now, in a scenario like that, where Demetrius ends up skipping out on Janibek and he vacates the brown belt,
Demetrius Andrade is a veteran of over 30 fights, a two-division champion, an unbeaten one, comes from a decorated amateur background, but he's 34 years old. At this point, he needs a signature fight as much as Janibek, and if he dips out on this guy, it better be for something better than a Janibek fight, as he will fast become a pariah.
you bail on Janibek, they're going to accuse you of ducking unless you're fighting somebody better than he is. A David Benavidez,
A Caleb Plant, a Jermall Charlo. There are big questions hanging over fights like that and how feasible those fights are at this time. But the bottom line is, if Demetrius Andrade ends up bailing on Janibek Alimkhanuly and surrenders the brown belt to him,
you can expect the duck word to get thrown around.
you better be bailing on this guy for something better. Otherwise, it's an according to Hoyle duck, because what else have you got to do? You got something better than trying to hang on to your alphabet title? What? You lose that alphabet title, people weren't lining up to fight you before when you were a champion. If you're not a champion anymore,
Delve even deeper into the who needs you club.
but if you fight this guy and you make it through him, the rest of your career is on the other side of that fight. And I don't know, maybe a situation can be negotiated between Demetrius and Top Rank, or Demetrius and the people over there at Sky Sports, who I hear are paying top dollar to attract talent to their platform. They went as far as signing Clarissa Shields to their UK-based network. Could a similar arrangement be reached between them and Demetrius Andrade?
It's looking more and more like his best bet is to make it through Janibek. Don't try to skip out on him. Don't try to skirt around him.
In men's lightweight news, per tweet from Michael Benson, Devine Haney versus George Kambosos Jr.'s rematch for Haney's undisputed WBA, WBC, IBF, and WBO lightweight world titles is reportedly now being planned for October 15th at the Rod Laver Arena in Melbourne, venue famous for hosting the Australian Open in tennis. Unlike Marvel Stadium, the Rod Laver Arena only houses about 14,000 people, a little over 14,000, accenting what I told you guys before about the demand for a second fight, the demand for a rematch. I don't really think there is one, given the aesthetic of the first fight. How many people really want to have to see that again, and how many people really think that George can do better in a second fight than he did in the first?
From 41,000 in attendance to possibly a little over 14,000.
The pay-per-view was reported to have sold approximately 60,000, or just under that number. Granted that the threshold for big pay-per-view buys in Australia, as opposed to in America, it is going to differ, but those don't sound like earth-shattering numbers.
The bottom line is, I don't know who wants to see this rematch, in America or in Australia.
The reigning undisputed lightweight champion Devine Haney reacted to this news himself, stating, "Cap, I haven't agreed to anything."
We know what the story was, that George Kambosos had the right to exercise a rematch clause if he loses, and the second fight would have to be in Australia.
But who in Australia really wants to see this? I don't know if the people in the land down under are convinced that George can do better in a second fight, but I know that I'm not. I don't think he can change that much in just one fight for this particular fight against this particular fighter. You're talking about the boxer-puncher versus the pure boxer. George being the boxer-puncher and Devine Haney being the pure boxer. And what you need to get the pure boxer out of his comfort zone is a good pressure fighter, a mid-range to inside guy that's not afraid to take one to give one, a volume puncher, guy with a good chin.
And a good engine. What makes a pressure fighter isn't as simple as just upping the tempo.
Various pressure fighters have various subtleties and nuances that make them unique in their own way, though generally speaking, the characteristic of a pressure fighter is a guy who's not afraid to take one to give one, volume puncher, guy who believes in his power, believes in his
as well.
aggression. You don't just decide to throw more punches and suddenly become a pressure fighter. There's a little bit more to it than that. I'd wager that a guy like Isaac Cruz could probably give Devin Haney a harder time than George Kambosos?
Not saying that Isaac Cruz would beat Devin Haney, but he would make Devin work for it more than George did.
It's the implementation. It's the approach. Bobbing and weaving, slipping and sliding under straight shots to get mid-range to inside on that pure boxer who's going to have to give up ground and try to keep the pressure guy out and keep him in front of him.
Try and control the distance with the lead hand. Try and control the distance with the jab against an oncoming opponent that might slip past it,
whilst firing looping shots and overhand rights that might actually connect. It's a more precarious situation when you're talking about the pure boxer versus the pressure fighter. There is the level at which the fighters compete that also needs to be considered. B-level pressure guy versus A-level pure boxer. That pure boxer likely still wins the match because he's competing at a higher level than that pressure guy, but he's still going to have to work for it. Whereas with George, he's a boxer puncher.
He's not just going to suddenly become a pressure guy overnight. It doesn't work like that.
Devin not only has a stylistic advantage over George Kambosos in terms of the fighters' base styles, though I'd also wager that he is competing at a higher level than George Kambosos Jr. is, and that's why Devin's victory over George was so dominant. He pitched a shutout on my card. I couldn't give George a round.
Like I said, I'm not keen on this rematch. I don't think it's necessary, but a contract's a contract, right?
Right. That's what Devin Haney signed. The only reason we're here now is because of the existing agreement going into the first fight that so empowered George to activate a rematch clause if things go sideways. And they did. Finally, in men's welterweight news, Terence Crawford very recently addressed the possibility of facing Jaron Boots Ennis. He stated, Jaron Ennis is going to be a force to be reckoned with. I'd fight him.
Terence is probably one of the only guys you're going to hear saying that.
I don't see very many welterweights with a profile addressing the possibility with any enthusiasm, any at all, the prospect of facing Jaron Boots Ennis. Terence says, Boots is a tremendous, talented guy. I've been watching him since his amateur days. He can fight both ways. He's very strong, knows boxing, and he's going to be a force to be reckoned with. Me and him, later on down the line, if that comes on my table and that's the right fight for me, I'm taking it all, said Crawford. Personally, if I was handling him, I would do whatever he wants to do at this point in time. He's proven that he belongs in the top echelon with the fights that he's fought. He deserves a shot. I'm not saying that he beat an elite fighter yet in the welterweight division, but the guys that he has fought, he's passed the test with flying colors. We'll never know until he gets there with the likes of the elite.
Well, who's elite at welterweight anymore? Who's elite at 147 pounds?
Errol Spence, Terence Crawford, those two guys are supposed to be settling up with each other. That's what we're waiting for, an official announcement. We're waiting for those two guys to get their fight over the line. So who does that leave Jaron Boots Ennis with? Danny Garcia, who moved up to junior middleweight, or Keith Thurman?
I'd be shocked if Keith took on a fight like that.
Jaron Ennis himself talked a big game when comparing himself to Terence Crawford. He says, I'm faster, stronger, smarter than Crawford. Ennis said last year, whatever he could do, I could do better. He's older, I'm younger. He fights right-handed, I fight right-handed. He's a great fighter, I don't take anything away from him. At the end of the day, it's boxing. If you want to be great, you have to fight the best. That's what's going to happen.
Is that what's going to happen?
I'm not holding my breath, and I'm not holding my breath because of what Terence Crawford said some weeks ago. He issued out a challenge beyond what is to be the Errol Spence Jr. fight for reigning undisputed junior middleweight champion Jermell Charlo.
Terence vowed that if he becomes undisputed at welterweight, if he becomes a two-time undisputed champion, he's going to shoot for 3.
He intends to move up to junior middleweight and take that guy on. So when you think about that, Jaron Ennis, good fighter, definitely passes the eye test, but there's not as much in it for Terence taking him on as there would be taking on Jermell Charlo. Jermell Charlo, who I thought by year's end would leave this division, leave the junior middleweight division, but that's not the case. He's supposed to return to action early next year against his WBO mandatory challenger, Tim Tszyu, in defense of his undisputed crown, because Jermell's not leaving.
Think about it. Think about the timeline. They're basically on the same schedule. If Crawford versus Spence happens later on this year,
Crawford emerges the victor, becomes the welterweight division's undisputed champion. Some weeks later, Jermell Charlo returns to action, beats Tim Tszyu the way a lot of people think he's going to beat Tim Tszyu.
The logical fight to make afterwards would be the fight between them, and you could perhaps bill it as a pay-per-view.
A Showtime pay-per-view, depending on the commercial success, or the lack thereof, comes to Crawford versus Spence. If the fight does robust numbers, generous enough that there's actually a profit margin, the logical thing to do would be to move Crawford into that fight. And because that's a fight that Crawford wants, the Jermell Charlo fight, should he beat Spence. Showtime!
They could get 2 really good fights, 2 good pay-per-views out of that.
So, I know that Terrence is entertaining the possibility of a Jaron Boots Ennis fight, and Jaron Boots Ennis is in line for the winner of Spence versus Crawford by way of the IBF as the winner of that fight's mandatory challenger.
And I understand all of that, but I don't know that that fight actually happens because you get more taking on Charlo than you do taking on Jaron Ennis.
You can't accuse someone as accomplished as a Terrence Crawford of avoiding a Jaron Ennis fight to take on an undisputed champion, another undisputed champion like himself at a higher weight in Jermell Charlo. It doesn't work like that. The idea behind ducking is avoiding a difficult fight for an easier one. And as much as I like Terrence Crawford, I don't know what his chances are as a junior middleweight. That would be his 4th division, his 4th weight class. We see what just happened to Canelo Alvarez in his 4th division, in his 4th weight class with Dimitri Bivol. At some point, size does come into it. At some point, size matters.
The more you move up, the more difficult the fights become.
Initially what I thought that if Jermell Charlo ended up knocking out Brian Castano the way I said he'd end up knocking out Brian Castano, that he would abruptly move up to the middleweight division, at which point his brother Jermall would move up to the super middleweight division. That's what I was expecting. What I wasn't expecting is that Jermell would decide to stay at 154 pounds for what is another year so he can take on Tim Tszyu early next year. I wasn't expecting that, and you could favor Jermell to beat Tim Tszyu. Tim, he's got no advantages over Jermell. Doesn't have the right base style or the right experience level. I don't think he's a bigger puncher than Jermell at this time. It's a fight Jermell stands a good chance of winning, so if he's still up there at 154 pounds, and he's still that division's undisputed champion, by the time Terrence takes care of Errol Spence Jr.,
That's the fight.
that's the fight to make. Terrence Crawford versus Jermell Charlo. Undisputed champion versus undisputed champion. As far as Jaron Ennis, he's going to have to make his bones fighting someone else. Maybe Radzav Butaev. Maybe Emantis Stanionis.
Those are all good fights with really good fighters at 147 pounds.
Hard to imagine that someone like Keith Thurman would give Jaron Ennis the time of day, though ideally he would be taking on a former champion.
Bottom line, I don't know if Crawford versus Ennis happens.